The Shining Force series was once Sega's flagship RPG franchise, spanning several releases on the Mega Drive, with the third landing on the Saturn in '98. The third game was slightly different though. Instead of just being one adventure, it would span 3 separate games focusing on different characters, but the West would unfortunately only ever get their hands on the first scenario. The narrative is easily one of the best aspects of the adventure and deals with several warring factions vying for power over the region. It can be somewhat confusing at times, especially for those who don't like to do a lot of reading, but it's really solid, with plenty of twists and turns to keep the player guessing, as well as providing a deep enough take on such a serious topic as war. As far as gameplay goes, Shining Force 3 doesn't really mix up the tried and tested formula of the previous game. It sees you visiting a whole range of unique locations and interacting with a cast of NPCs, but the real meat and potatoes are within battle, which sees you commanding a party of up to 12 members as you carry out turn-based combat on a grid. All of your commands and menus are accessed by the incredibly intuitive 4-icon menu, a tradition in the Shining series, which makes this game's learning curve extremely minimal. Each character has simple commands like attack, item, hold or magic, but it still requires a bit more strategy than many of the others on the system. Of course, you can promote your characters when they reach a certain level, as well as access to new weapons. This keeps the gameplay fresh as you progress. Shining Force 3 is a bit of a mixed bag. Navigating your way through the world can be a bit tough on the eyes. These minor issues don't stop Shining Force from being a great game, and while it may no longer be the most accessible RPG due to its price, it's still one that's worth playing through, especially for fans of the genre. For those not familiar with the X series of Mega Man, it's essentially an action RPG that borrows many elements from the standard platforming adventures. The first 3 installments were on the Super Nintendo, however Capcom sensed the potential of the PlayStation 1 and Saturn and decided to make the next installment for them instead. What made it stand out was that X4 was the first game to actually have a decent plot, which revolved around the characters of X and Zero as they set out to take down the Repla Force, a group of elite hunters hell-bent on destruction. You got the choice of 2 characters, and this was a first for the series, granting players the ability to play as Zero. Now there's subtle differences between the two. X is almost exactly how he's been for so many years, perfectly balanced and a lot of fun to play. Zero on the other hand plays slightly slower because his sword is only used for close combat. To make up for him not being able to shoot across the screen, his sword is a little more powerful than the standard blaster and can be swung a few times in a row for a nice combo. The game is structured into stages with about 8 in total, which all have a challenging boss waiting for you at the end. Once you defeat them, you get to acquire their weapon and add it to your arsenal, allowing you to defeat the next boss that much easier. That isn't their only purpose though. You'll need many of them to find some of the game's special items, such as heart tanks which raise your health bar, or sub tanks which give you a spare health bar, as well as armor upgrades which give you special benefits as well. By the time the game is coming to a close, you'll have a generous amount of options when it comes to disposing of your enemies, and in general will make you feel like a complete badass. While other Capcom games, namely their Street Fighter series, took full advantage of the system's 2D capabilities, Mega Man X4's graphics seem a bit flawed. The most glaring of these flaws lies in the handling of transparencies, and while it might have been better to see Capcom take full advantage of the Saturn's 2D abilities, it's still a blast to play. An FMV game isn't an FMV game without a good story, and thankfully Lunacy does not disappoint. It sees you taking up the part of Fred as you wake up inside a mysterious city where dreams seem to come true for its inhabitants. Since Lunacy leans a lot on its narrative for its enjoyment, I won't go into it too much, but rest assured the story is easily the best aspect of the game, and it gets a lot better and far more suspenseful the more you progress, until ultimately everything is revealed. Now some may argue with this, saying that there is no gameplay in an FMV game, but there is. It all takes place in the City of Mist, run by the insidious Lord Gordon, with about 30 different locations that you can visit throughout. Your ultimate goal is to get down to the bottom of a well in the center of the city, but to do this you'll need to speak with and get to know all of the characters that occupy the space, get valuable items off them by bartering, and using your wits to figure out the various puzzles in the game. With all of the locations throughout the game, you'll be backtracking and revisiting a lot, Sometimes when nothing seems to work, you need to return to a certain person's house and talk to them to get the game in motion again. That's the only gripe I have with the gameplay really. It's fun and easy to pick up, relying more on smarts than gameplay and ability. And when it comes to presentation, as you would expect, the visuals are quite impressive. The animation is fluid and smooth, with no slowdown whatsoever. The problem is in certain panning scenes. It gets slightly grainy and quite pixelated, but not enough to ruin the adventure on the whole. The characters themselves, however, move stiffly in certain scenes, which can be downright laughable at points, watching them fumble around the screen in a sort of stop-motion fashion. But in my eyes, this just adds to the charm of the game. Although there's far better experiences to be had on the Sega Saturn, Lunacy is still worth trying out if you're curious. Saturn Bomberman is hands down one of the best entries in the series. If you've been around long enough, you should know the concept of Bomberman by now, which is so simple, allowing it to be enjoyed by any type of player. It basically sees you trying to clear each of the stages you're presented with, which are all littered with a variety of enemies and obstacles to overcome. You can set bombs either vertically or horizontally that creates traps for your targets to walk into, and on top of this you get various items that help you to become even more powerful. There are 8 in total, which all add a slew of strategic options for the player to take advantage of. In this game you'll find several dinosaur eggs lying around each of the stages as well, and there's 5 of them in total. You've got purple, blue, green, pink and yellow, and a lot like the power-ups, once they have been hatched, they all offer different abilities for the player to use, such as being able to emit ultrasonic waves to blow up bombs, to sprinting incredibly fast. All in all, each of them will manage to prove themselves useful to your quest for victory. Now the game is made up of 3 modes to play, which are Story Mode, Battle and Master. Story Mode is your basic single player option, whereas Battle can support up to 10 players, and finally Master Mode, providing the bulk of the challenge, as it tasks you with having to complete several stages against the clock. However, to really see what Saturn Bomberman is made of, you must play it with other people. This is where the game well and truly comes to life, and provides some of the best multiplayer moments you'll have on the console, although it's a bit pricey these days, and I wouldn't be able to sit here with a straight face and recommend actually buying it, but it's a really good game and one that demands a re-release on modern consoles. Battlesport first made an appearance on the 3DO back in 1996 and never managed to make too much of an impact. The decision was made to port it to the Sega Saturn as well as the PlayStation and PC in the hopes of reaching a wider audience. Now it's basically a fast-paced arcade style affair that all revolves around simply scoring points and stopping your opponents in their track. It's a bit tricky to describe, but it sort of comes off as a combination of football and hockey spliced with a dose of shooting. The rules are relatively simple, with 2 nearly 30-ton hovercrafts racing around an arena trying to acquire a bouncing ball and ultimately shooting it towards the goal for points. The action is rather intense, but unfortunately one of Battlespot's major flaws are the controls. Unlike traditional 3D shooters where you can stop and pivot in any direction with ease, there seems to be some kind of unexplained gravitational pull on your ship, often causing you to fly right past the ball even though you appear to be headed straight for it, and the fact that you're stuck in the cockpit view with no peripheral or rear view vision doesn't help one bit. To its credit though, Battlesport boasts a total of 50 different arenas, each one with its own unique characteristics and layout. There's also a generous amount of different ships and weapons which can all be earned by spending the money you receive from winning. Games can be played with a selectable number of goals or designated amount of time, and after each contest a full list of stats is displayed, including number of misses, interceptions, kills and goals. And to spice up the gameplay even further, a range of intriguing power-ups like blindness, as well as one known as Ball Attract, are placed randomly throughout the playing field, allowing the player to quickly gain the upper hand if they find themselves in a bit of a pinch. While the basic gameplay eventually becomes repetitive, there's enough customizable options and various details to keep things mildly entertaining. Although the concept is great, overall Battlesport is just let down by those cumbersome controls, which makes it really hard to recommend, even if there are some positives to it. Starting out life in the arcades way back in 1996, the House of the Dead series went on to become a staple of the arcade scene, which prompted Sega to release it for their at the time new home console, the Saturn. One of Sega's AM departments was responsible for initially programming the game, but the Saturn port was handled by a third party. The difference in talent between Sega's internal teams and an outside one was never so apparent, with it bearing little visual resemblance to the original arcade version. House of the Dead is simply one of the ugliest best games on the system. Everything on screen is of low-res quality, and when you couple this with the alarming frame rate, it becomes a bit harsh on the eyes. Of course, the same cannot be said for the gameplay, which largely remains intact. You get to search a creepy mansion and progress through a series of locations whilst taking out hordes of zombies and other nasties. A nice inclusion was the option of branching paths, which does add a nice bit of variety to each playthrough, as well as several boss encounters, which manage to amp up the action quite nicely. Now when it comes to replay value, the game hasn't got that much going for it. You can unlock extra costumes which feel rather pointless from a first person perspective, as well as a few different endings and several modes for the player to try out. Of course there's arcade, which is self-explanatory, but you've also got Saturn, which allows you to choose from several different characters, and finally boss mode, which allows you to tackle all of the game's bosses one after the other. If I'm being honest, the most fun I had was with the boss mode, which offers up a decent amount of challenge. Although the Saturn version has clearly got its issues, it's still relatively fun to play through, but there are much better offerings on the system like Virtual Cop, which feel far superior in almost every single way. Mega Man 8 was released in two different versions. You had one for the Sega Saturn and the other for the PlayStation 1. If you were wondering which was the best out of the two, it would have to be the Saturn, which is mainly due to how Capcom took advantage of its 2D capabilities. Every level is loaded with colour and transparency effects that make the game feel that much more alive when compared to its counterpart. Like many platformers, there's not that much of a story to get invested in, with much of the enjoyment coming from the gameplay itself, and despite there being an honest attempt by Capcom at weaving a tale, it just never goes anywhere. Much like the previous games, Mega Man 8 is a 2D action side-scroller, in which you take on a series of enemy bosses, collect their unique power-ups, and ultimately take on their creator, the evil Dr. Willy. You've got your basic run and jump, as well as access to several weapons and slides that make getting around enemies and obstacles an absolute breeze. Charging your blaster and unleashing a shot that obliterates everything in its path is just as satisfying as it ever was. Mega Man 8 is quite challenging, but experienced gamers will be able to run, jump and shoot through it without much trouble. Overall, I personally prefer the Mega Man X series and would likely recommend that one instead of 8. It does have good qualities like I've mentioned, but it just can't compare in my eyes. Burning Rangers released well into the Saturn's life cycle, but would go on to become one of the most memorable games on the system. It sees you taking on the role of one futuristic firefighter, with the goal being to extinguish fires and rescue civilians as you progress through the range of levels that naturally increase in difficulty the further you push. As a firefighter, you have three basic tools. You've got your fire suppression gun, a jetpack, as well as a navigator, which all work together to help the player navigate each environment. The fire suppression gun can be used in two different ways. The first is to fire it in short bursts by tapping the fire button, which puts out fires rather slowly, but in the process it turns them into crystals which can be used to power your shield. The second way is to use the gun to create an explosive vacuum. You accomplish this by holding down the fire button instead, and then releasing the shot once it's fully charged. This puts out even the most powerful flames, but destroys all of the potential crystals in the process. Balancing between the two and keeping your shield stocked up creates a pretty addictive gameplay loop that is hard to put down. Now Burning Rangers is a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to visuals. It's probably the most technologically accomplished 3D game on the Saturn, but it's let down in one main area. Transparency effects are used abundantly throughout the game, but unfortunately they are mesh, which the Saturn was well known for having a hard time with. But that is the only real negative to find, as the colours and lighting effects in the game are really well done, especially for a Saturn title, with each character themselves managing to look superb and quite futuristic on top of it. Admittedly, the camera can become a bit of a nuisance when the on-screen action ramps up, but it doesn't impact the gameplay too much. Aside from the rangers and the civilians to be rescued, the enemies also have a nice design to them, while the end-level bosses take it to the next level and provide some of the best moments in the game. Overall, Burning Rangers was an incredibly ambitious title. It achieved what it set out to do, even with the small compromises in graphical quality, as the gameplay is just so damn good. Magic Knight Rayearth is well known for two reasons. The first being that it's a pretty solid RPG that has managed to stand the test of time, and the second being that it was actually the last Sega Saturn game to ever be released officially. The story isn't very original and is actually based on the anime of the same name, which for the most part it manages to stay true to. You take on the role of three girls who accidentally get transported to another world. It's not long before they quickly have to take up the fight to save a princess kidnapped by the cliche big bad. Honestly, surface it sounds pretty basic, but the gameplay is what really helps Magic Knight excel. It takes many cues from the early Zelda games and presents the action from a sort of top-down perspective. The twist, however, is that you actually get to control all of the characters at once and can easily switch between them on the fly. Naturally, each of them have their own specific pros and cons when it comes to dealing with each situation. From magic to individual skills, there's plenty of variety that makes combat the real star of the show. This is no more apparent than in the boss fights, where you've got to utilize each of the characters constantly to bring them down. The world of Magic Knight Rayearth is simply stunning. From the backgrounds to the buildings and obstacles themselves, the characters as well look just as great and are highly detailed for their size. This transitions nicely to the enemies and NPCs as well, so travelling through each of the several dungeons and towns never gets old. On the whole, it is just a fantastic game from top to bottom, and can be ranked along with heavy hitters like Grandia, Suikoden and Panzer Dragoon Saga as one of the Saturn's best RPGs. The game just oozes quality and is great in almost every aspect. It's just too bad that it was released so late in the Saturn's life in the West, as it might have managed to have made a bigger impact earlier on. Panzer Dragoon Saga was released near the end of the Saturn's life in an effort to go out in one final bang before the system faded. Even with making the third game an RPG rather than a familiar shooter like the first two were, they fully succeeded in doing so. What really sets Panzer Dragoon Saga's story apart from other RPGs is not only the quality of the script, but the way each and every character grows in a believable way. The protagonist Edge matures from an immature soldier to a savior, with the several relationships you'll make along the way providing for some dismal and thought-provoking consequences. But one of the biggest strong points about Panzer Dragoon Saga is the combat system. Battles are waged on top of a dragon, sometimes with a supporting character riding with you. Each enemy has their own specific weak points, so no single type of enemy can be destroyed the same way as you weave in and out of danger spots in an effort to bring them down. Now you've got two main attacks. One is to have Edge fire his gun, which can be upgraded to fire at multiple enemies at once, or even cause extra damage than normal to weak points. The other attack is the dragon's homing laser, which causes it to fire several homing shots at the nearest enemies. Then there's the berserk powers, which is basically Panzer Dragoon Saga's take on magic. These powers range from a fury of hits to heighten your stats to summoning creatures to attack, but the order in which you learn these berserk powers is different depending on how you set your dragon up. There's several stats to take into consideration, such as attack or defense, which have a noticeable difference on the field. This allows the player to tailor the experience to their specific style of play, as well as adding a bit of extra strategy to each encounter. Now, is it really worth all the money it goes for these days? Of course not, unless you're a die-hard fan or just have money to burn. As good as the game is, I just cannot recommend buying games at these prices. Thankfully, there's a pretty robust emulator for the Saturn, which is always a good option. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for the PAL version of this video, which will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. You can follow me on all of the socials to stay up to date, and also join our growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to our Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skill Jim, Nano, Steve, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Paul, Quinn, Dio, Alex, Simon and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining the Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of the links in the description. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you in the next one.